Verdun was one of the great battles of the First World War, the longest battle of 300 days and 300 nights, a battle that cost France and Germany 770,000 casualties in 1916, and a battlefield that 1,000 shells fell for every square metre. In the opening barrage alone, 2.5 million shells fell in 9 hours and turned this battlefield into a vast lunar landscape. And today I've come up to the village, or what is left of the village of Fleury, one of the small villages that existed on these Meuse heights above the city of Verdun, and where the fighting took place in 1916. And this was a front-line village as the Germans attacked over to my right to the northern end of the battlefield at the Bois de Cour, where Colonel Driant was with his chasseurs à pied, the light infantry, and then overrun Fort Douaumont. Gradually they fought their way across this landscape, and around me now are the shell holes and the remains of the trenches, and Fleury became part of that front line. In one battle alone, in June of 1916, on the 23rd of June, the German Alpen Corps attacked from that direction. They'd just arrived on the Western Front. They'd come from Macedonia. This was their first battle, and German Jaeger regiments advanced across this ground towards where we are now, which was defended by the 239th Regiment of Infantry. And one of their officers, Captain Pierre Hans, went out and defended this ground with 2 machine guns, with a Hotchkiss or Saint-Etienne. Him and another sergeant set up the guns, and they fired across this ground, obscured today because of the trees, but they fired across this ground an incredible 18,000 rounds from their weapons and stopped that German Alpen Corps advance on this part of the battlefield. And this then became the front line for the rest of the battle until the French counter-offensive went from here up across the ground, and in October 1916, Verdun, the ground north of Verdun, and Fort Douaumont was retaken. They never quite retook the original lines, particularly up at the Bois de Cour, but Verdun went from almost defeat from the French to a kind of victory by the late autumn and into the winter, early winter of 1916. And for the wider effect on the Western Front, this was a battle in which the Germans, with the beginning of the Somme offensive on the 1st of July, this was a battle where the Germans could not continue to attack here at Verdun and defend on the Somme. So the last German attack here took place in July 1916, just after the Somme offensive began. The Germans got up onto the Fort Souville, just ahead of me in the distance there, defended by the French troops in that part of the battlefield, and some German stormtroops got up onto the roof of the fort. They could look down into Verdun, see the sun glinting on the blue Meuse, and that was as far as any German soldier got towards Verdun in 1916. But it came to symbolise, really, both for France and Germany, the terrible experience of the war for the ordinary soldier in this lunar landscape of shell holes, of mud, of terrible conditions, and of death and destruction on such a large scale. After the First World War, Verdun became this symbol, really, of French sacrifice, of service in the Great War. And there was that famous phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. And at Verdun they didn't. The line held. And there was a move to memorialise Verdun by planting it as a national forest. And in doing so, a whole number of villages completely disappeared, including the village we're going to walk into now, the village of Fleury. In memorialising the battlefield of Verdun by planting a national forest on it, it meant that certain villages were essentially sacrificed. And Fleury was one of those villages détruits, destroyed villages, sometimes called villages disparus, disappeared villages that were never rebuilt. There's a lot of mythology about that. If you read some of the press reports during the Great War centenary, you'll read about this being still part of the Zone Rouge, the red zone. And of course, once this was, to qualify to be part of the red zone, you had to be a community that suffered a minimum of 80% destruction, and places like Fleury were blown off the map. But here at Verdun, to make this a national forest, and an attempt to do that was also suggested on the British front as well. Churchill went to Ypres in 1919 and suggested that Ypres was forested and to preserve it for future generations. But it meant here at Verdun that Fleury was one of a number of villages that was sacrificed in this way and was never rebuilt. It still had a mayor, still has a mayor to this day, but it's a ghost village now. There's nothing of it. And as I walk down now, I'm passing little stone markers that mark some of the houses. The layout of the old village of Fleury is still marked by these stone markers with plaques on them, marking the boulangerie, the baker, the school, and the various houses. But nothing apart from a few broken pieces of stone and the odd bit of battlefield detritus. That's all that remains of the original village of Fleury that stood here probably for over 1,000 years until the Great War completely destroyed it. And around me are the shell holes and the crumbling trenches that led into this as a forward fighting position in 1916. Behind me, that ground where Captain Pierre Hans and the men of the 239 Regiment of Infantry beat off the German Alpen Corps, the German Jägers, who attacked this position in June of 1916. And I think this is really, when you come here, and I've got this pretty much to myself today, this is the essence of the modern Verdun experience. Coming to somewhere like this and seeing this kind of sheer lunar landscape of shell holes still here, trenches amongst it, and villages literally blown off the map. It's a very affecting battlefield to come to, and one that I think makes you pause for thought of what it must have been like in the conditions here of 1916. I first came to Verdun in 1987, when just walking off of a track here you could find steel helmets and water bottles and entrenching tools. That's disappeared from the landscape today, but it remains one of the most impressive Great War battlefields that I visit as part of my career as a battlefield guide, but as part of that lifelong interest in the Great War. And I feel particularly connected to Verdun because of my French ancestry. My grandmother was French, and part of her family, the Rosets, served here at Verdun in 1916. This is a battlefield that speaks for France. If you speak to most French people and ask them, do they have a relative in the Great War? Did they fight? Where did they fight? They will always say Verdun, whether it is Verdun or not. And I think that's the power of it. It symbolises an entire generation for France, and it symbolises the entire war. And the hellish nature of that war, when we look at the pictures of the smashed landscape, the lunar landscapes of shell holes, those ravines with stunted trees, it was hell on earth for these men who served here in the mincing machine of Verdun in 1916.